The mere mention of this game is enough to spark heated debates about combos and character mains. Released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1995, Killer Instinct. At a time when the fighting game genre was dominated by juggernauts like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, this game came out swinging, determined to carve out its own legacy. The Super Nintendo version of Killer Instinct is a fascinating piece of gaming history. It was developed during Rare's golden era, when the company was churning out instant classics like Donkey Kong Country and Battletoads. With Nintendo acting as publisher, Rare had the daunting task of condensing the high-powered arcade experience into a 16-bit cartridge. This wasn't just any arcade game, though. Killer Instinct was running on hardware co-developed by Rare and Midway, dubbed the Ultra 64, which eventually became the basis for the Nintendo 64 console, translating that next-gen arcade pizzazz to a much weaker Super Nintendo platform was nothing short of ambitious. Unlike many other fighting games of the 90s, which often tacked on a thin plot as an afterthought, Killer Instinct took its story seriously, relatively speaking, of course. At the heart of the game's narrative is the sinister megacorporation Ultratech, whose shadowy experiments and greed for power set the stage for a deadly tournament unlike any other. The Killer Instinct tournament is Ultratech's grand spectacle, a lethal blend of blood sport and scientific experimentation. They use the event not just to entertain the masses, but also as a proving ground for their nightmarish creations. Ultratech's experiments blur the line between man and machine, nature and technology, resulting in the monstrous fighters that populate the game's roster. Each character has their own reasons for entering the tournament, and their stories intersect in intriguing, sometimes tragic ways. Take Jago, for example, a monk guided by the mysterious tiger spirit. He enters the tournament seeking enlightenment, only to find himself caught in a web of Ultratech's corruption. On the other end of the spectrum, you have characters like Fulgore, the cold and calculating cyborg. Designed by Ultratech as the ultimate killing machine, Fulgore's entry into the tournament is more than just a test run. It's a display of Ultratech's might. The game's narrative, though simple by modern standards, tapped into the darker storytelling trends of the 90s. There's a grim tone to Killer Instinct that sets it apart from other fighting games. This isn't the whimsical world of Street Fighter or the campy gore of Mortal Kombat. However, the story wasn't conveyed in a traditional cinematic sense. Like many games of the time, much of Killer Instinct's lore was found in character bios, windscreens, and supplemental materials like manuals. Fans had to piece together the bigger picture, which only added to the mystique. In an era where fighting games were ruled by Street Fighter II's deliberate strategy and Mortal Kombat's bloody spectacle, Killer Instinct carved out its niche with a heavy focus on combo mechanics, flashy special moves, and a level of intensity that set it apart from its contemporaries. Even with the limitations of 16-bit hardware, Rare managed to deliver a game that felt fast, fluid, and exhilarating. At the heart of Killer Instinct's gameplay is its now iconic combo system. Rather than relying solely on single-input special moves like fireballs or uppercuts, the game encouraged players to chain attacks together into devastatingly long combos. This wasn't just about mashing buttons. The system required timing and precision. Players could link normal attacks into special moves and then extend those into combo finishers, racking up massive damage if executed correctly. Landing a 20-hit ultra combo wasn't just effective, it felt like a mic drop moment. One of the game's most innovative features was the inclusion of combo breakers. These allowed players to interrupt an opponent's combo if they could predict their next move, adding a layer of strategy to the chaos. Combo breakers were a lifesaver. If you were caught in a seemingly unstoppable juggle, the right input at the right time could turn the tide. The character roster in Killer Instinct was another standout feature. Each fighter had their own distinct playstyle, complete with unique special moves and combo options. What really set these characters apart, though, was their variety. From Saberwolf's primal slashes to Fulgore's futuristic laser attacks, each fighter felt like they came from a completely different world. Due to hardware limitations, the game's controls weren't as tight as the arcade original. While the 6-button layout mirrored that of Street Fighter II, some players found the inputs less responsive, particularly when trying to execute intricate combos. Additionally, balancing issues plagued the roster, with certain characters feeling significantly stronger than others. Despite these flaws, Killer Instinct's gameplay on the Super Nintendo retained the addictive energy that made the arcade version so beloved. It wasn't just about who could land the most hits, it was about how stylishly you could dominate. Each match felt like a spectacle, from the soaring projectiles to the crowd-cheering ultra combos. Rare managed to distill the essence of the arcade experience into a home console format, and for fans of high-octane fighting games, Killer Instinct was a revelation. If there's one thing Killer Instinct on the Super Nintendo got right, it was its unforgettable style. From its striking visuals to its pulse-pounding soundtrack, the game made a statement with its presentation. Rare didn't just settle for porting the gameplay from the arcade. They worked hard to bring the look and feel of the arcade version to Nintendo's 16-bit powerhouse, and while compromises were inevitable, the result was still impressive for the time. One of the defining features of Killer Instinct was its use of pre-rendered 3D models, a technique Rare had mastered during the development of Donkey Kong Country. By rendering characters and environments on high-end Silicon graphics workstations and then compressing them into sprites, the game achieved a pseudo-3D look that felt revolutionary in 1995. This translated to crisp, detailed character sprites that looked far more advanced than most other fighting games on the system. While the animations were understandably less fluid than in the arcade version, the fighters retained a level of detail that made them instantly recognizable. The transition from arcade to Super Nintendo wasn't entirely seamless. The arcade version's stages featured rich lighting effects and background animations that simply couldn't be replicated on the Super Nintendo. As a result, some stages felt static by comparison. Similarly, the framerate took a hit, which occasionally made the game feel less smooth than its arcade counterpart. Now, onto the sound, an area where Killer Instinct truly shined. The soundtrack was composed by Robin Beanland and Graham Norgate, who blended a variety of genres to create one of the most memorable soundscapes in fighting game history. The standout feature, of course, was the announcer. His booming voice, calling out Combo Breaker and Ultra Combo, became an iconic part of the game's identity. Even on the SNES, his lines were loud and clear, adding a layer of hype to every match. The announcer wasn't just a narrator, he was part of the action, amplifying the adrenaline every time you pulled off a high-damage combo. For many players, Killer Instinct wasn't just a fighting game, it was a spectacle. From the metallic sheen of Fulgor's armor to the haunting melodies of Spinal's stage, the graphics and sound worked together to create an experience that felt larger than life, even on a 16-bit console. Rare's attention to detail ensured that the game would remain a visual and auditory benchmark for years to come. The legacy of Killer Instinct on the Super Nintendo is as impactful as the combos it introduced to the fighting game genre. Released during a golden age of arcade ports, this title managed to stand tall alongside giants like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, carving out a unique identity that still resonates with fans today. Rare's bold attempt to bring an arcade powerhouse to a 16-bit console paid off, setting the stage for a franchise that continues to thrive decades later. For players, Killer Instinct brought the arcade experience home in a way that few games of the time could. In an era when visiting the local arcade was still a weekend ritual for many, the ability to replicate that same excitement on the Super Nintendo was a big deal. Sure, the Super Nintendo version wasn't perfect, the visuals, sound, and gameplay were scaled down to fit the console's limitations, but for most fans, it was a dream come true. Killer Instinct's legacy isn't without its flaws. While the game was praised for its style and innovation, some critics noted its steep learning curve and balancing issues. Casual players could find themselves overwhelmed by the intricate combo system, while seasoned veterans occasionally exploited overpowered characters like Cinder. These issues didn't destroy the game's reputation, but they were blemishes on an otherwise stellar title. Perhaps the biggest testament to Killer Instinct's legacy is its enduring fan base. Even after Rare moved on to other projects and the series went dormant for years, fans kept the game's spirit alive. The franchise's 2013 revival on the Xbox One brought Killer Instinct back into the spotlight, but its foundation was built on the Super Nintendo version's success. In the end, the Super Nintendo version of Killer Instinct is more than just a port, it's a milestone in gaming history. It brought arcade-quality fighting to home consoles, pushed the limits of what the Super Nintendo was capable of, and introduced a generation of players to a world of brutal combos, iconic characters, and unforgettable style. It's a game that not only defined its time, but continues to inspire new generations of players and developers alike.